Hey everyone, this is lecture 11 for POS 273 International Relations, an online undergraduate course taught at the University of Maine. I'm Rob Glover, the instructor. Today's lecture covers terrorism. It's kind of a follow-up to our discussion of international security. Terrorism is obviously deeply related to international security. It's kind of a subtopic. But we're going to zero in and focus more specifically on terrorism in today's lecture. So we're going to talk about what is terrorism and what motivates terrorism. We'll also talk about how has globalization shaped the development of terrorism, and we'll close by discussing how we fight terrorism, what's sometimes called counterterrorism. So defining terrorism is tricky. Last time we talked about asymmetrical warfare. Terrorism is typically defined as a type of asymmetrical warfare. Specifically labeling something as terrorism is often a complex kind of political debate. If you've been following the news this summer, there's been quite a bit of discussion about various mass shootings, and so like the Kyle Roof shooting in Charleston. Do we define that as terrorism? This is an individual that identifies with a certain cause and a certain hatred of specific groups based on race. Do we want to call that terrorism? And there is this old adage that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. That is, I think, frequently the case. That violence used on behalf of a political cause, depending on how you view the legitimacy of the political cause and how extreme the violence is, that will often shape your definition of whether something is terrorism or it's a perfectly legitimate struggle. The American Revolution, the types of tactics that they were engaging in are not altogether different than some of the tactics that we associate with terrorism today. But obviously we believe in the legitimacy of that cause, and we believe in, anti-British, anti-imperial struggles, and so we would never think to define that as terrorist activity. So it's a really complex thing to sort out once we get to defining whether a specific action or a specific group qualifies as terrorism. Defining terrorism just in general is challenging. Historically, terror, when we use the term terrorism or terror, that meant violence that was employed by the state against citizens. So if you're familiar with the French Revolution, if you've had a Western Civ course or a world history course and you've looked at the French Revolution, there was a period after the initial overthrow of the monarchy that was referred to as the Terror, and that was this massive wave of revolutionary violence in which members of the monarchy and the aristocracy were being put to death by the thousands. The street literally ran red with their blood. And that period was referred to as the Terror. So that was an instance in which the state was actually utilizing violence against its citizens. But we use it in a different way today. So as I said, asymmetrical, unconventional warfare, terrorism is a subtype of that, which we talked about last time. Today, when we use the term terrorism, we're generally referring to violence by non-state groups or networks to achieve a political end. There's some sort of political goal. It's usually rooted in some sort of perceived ideological, ethnic, religious grievance that is long-standing. Those who are engaged in the violence will say, we've tried every strategy to address this issue, and violence is the only means left to address it. We tried via other means, and here is where we're at. This is the only means to address this long-standing injustice or this long-standing grievance. So we have resorted to violence. It's designed to be shocking. It's designed to be disruptive. It is designed to be unconventional. Terrorist networks are not going to fight in the same ways that conventional war or conventional military operations are carried out, in part because of the disparity in power, usually. When we're talking about terrorist groups, we're talking about individuals and collectivities that cannot fight an equally matched fight on the battlefield, so they have to resort to other means. Again, this goes back to that idea of asymmetric warfare that we talked about. There's terminology that's sometimes used to refer to terrorism, weapons of the weak, right? These are individuals that have to use a more diverse, more eclectic set of tools to achieve their objectives because they don't have the power and they don't have the numbers and they don't have the same types of military hardware. So what we see used in terrorism is often, very ingenious kind of use of reappropriation of resources that are utilized in ways that we wouldn't typically expect them to be used. Nobody really had a sense that that prior to 9/11 that we were constantly a threat anytime we were flying, that our plane was going to be turned into a missile that would then be deployed against U.S. buildings or U.S. military targets. That is horrifying and upsetting, but ingenious in terms of the way that you use the tools, you use the weaknesses, the strengths that are available to you in ways to have maximum effect. That's really what is so unnerving about terrorism, is that the things that we have within our society are then turned against us in some sort of deadly and violent way. And terrorism may, and the may part is very important, terrorism may draw very little distinction between hard and soft targets. When we talk about hard and soft targets, so if a group had a political grievance, the hard targets for that political grievance, say that they're upset at the United States government. The hard targets are going to be things like, the military, the police force, the government, right? And if they're attacking hard targets, they might be attacking military bases or police stations or things like that. Soft targets are going to be settings in which there are civilians, there are children, there are people going about their day that might not be linked to the apparatus of the state or whoever the adversary is in any real kind of concrete way other than simply being there. And sometimes, again, this is one of the shocking things about terrorism, there'll be very little distinction drawn between the hard and the soft target. That's not universal, though, and it's a mistake to think that one of the defining factors of terrorism is that they're completely willing to kill civilians. There have been many terrorist groups that's a really important distinction. There's a group called ETA, ETA, ETA. It was a separatist group in Spain that there's a region in Spain called the Basque region. They speak a different language. They're ethnically distinct. They've always viewed themselves as an entity apart from Spain. And they developed this radical separatist group, ETA, that sought to have an independent state, to have the Basque region be its own autonomous entity separate from Spain. And they would make really, really significant efforts when they were engaging in bombing, which they were doing all throughout the 1970s and the 1980s. They would make a significant effort not to hit civilian targets. And if they had called in a bombing attack, so they were going to bomb a government office, they would give notice ahead of time saying, there's a bomb in this office, it's going to go off in 2 hours, you need to get everybody out, this is ETA, here's what we stand for. So it is a mistake to say that terrorist groups always zero in on the soft targets, the civilians, the people that just happen to be in the way. They don't necessarily, although much of the violence that we've seen recently, for instance, with something like the Islamic State, really not drawing any distinctions between a military target, a civilian target. They're picking up people simply on the basis of their ethnicity or the basis of their religion and targeting them on that basis. So that is sometimes a defining feature of terrorism. What are the motivators for terrorism? At the broadest level, the most kind of macro level, we can talk about 4 different types of motivations. This would be, if you were talking to a representative of this terrorist group, so what do you stand for? What is your goal? What are those objectives that you want to achieve and you're willing to use violence in order to achieve them? We could talk about left-wing, right-wing, ethno-nationalist or separatist, and religious or sacred. Left-wing would be groups that have a left-wing ideology. They're to the left. So, for instance, Cuba now is a communist nation, has been a communist nation since about 1960, 1959. Prior to the communists taking power and Fidel Castro and his brother and Che Guevara taking control in Cuba, they were a rebel guerrilla group fighting the Cuban military and the Cuban government out of the mountains, coming down out of the jungle and engaging in an attack and then disappearing back into the jungle. Prior to their victory and then achieving control of the state, we would say that's a terrorist group. It's a left-wing terrorist group engaging in guerrilla warfare. Here's another instance in which it becomes complicated, because if you believe strongly in the cause of the Cuban communists, then you say, no, those are freedom fighters. They had a corrupt regime that they were trying to displace. But there's other examples. There's a group called the Shining Path in Peru. That's they're Maoists. They're these left-wing rebels. So they have kind of a left-wing ideology, communists, anarchists, right? And they engage in violence on that basis. Right-wing would be, examples would be things like the neo-Nazis. If we did choose to classify the shooting in Charleston as a terrorist act, that would be a right-wing motivation. So somebody that has a notion of racial hierarchy, and he believes that whites are superior to people of color and minorities, and so he's engaging in violence on behalf of that cause. So right-wing is kind of the other end of the political spectrum. It's associated with fascism and various racist ideologies. Ethno-nationalist and separatist is a little bit easier to sort out. This would be a group that has some sort of grievance, some sort of disagreement with the current composition of a country. So I mentioned ETA, right? That is a country that is looking at the existing configuration of Spain and saying this isn't right. We're grouped in with a country that we shouldn't be a part of. We should be a separate country. And so we are going to fight in order to try to achieve that. We're going to engage in violence to try to achieve that. Another example would be the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, which was protesting against British occupation of Northern Ireland. They viewed that as colonialism, as the British imposing their will upon a group that they had conquered, and they wanted to rectify that. So there's plenty of different examples. Chechnya and some of the other areas in Russia that are engaging in violence to try to achieve a separate state. They don't view themselves as part of Russia, would be an example. So these are just different groups of people that, for whatever reason, this constellation of countries, this configuration of political geography is incorrect, and we want a separate state. We want to be apart from it. Religious and sacred, really, what springs to mind immediately is some of the extremism that we see in the Middle East or North Africa, things like Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State. But it extends far beyond that. There's, you look at any religion, and there is some sort of fundamentalist wing that is willing to engage in violence to advance their goals, whatever their goals might be. So we see this in Christianity, we see this in Islam, we see this even in religions that one wouldn't think of typically as violent, like Hinduism and Buddhism. There are extremists that engage in violence, and their religion or their interpretation of their religion, which is often a minority interpretation. A lot of people think that they get it fundamentally wrong and go against the fundamental beliefs of the religion, but that is their motivation, and their goals are guided by their interpretation of their own religion. Frequently the case that these sorts of radical groups are viewed as completely misunderstanding the religion. That's one of the arguments made by the vast majority of the world's Muslims about the Islamic State, is that they purport to represent Islam, but they fundamentally go against major tenets of Islam in terms of pursuing their goals and the actions that they engage in with regard to violence. So that pretty much captures the major distinctions between different types of terrorism at the level of motivations for the cause. If you were to seek out a representative of one of these groups and say, what do you believe in? What is it that you want? These are the types of things that they would respond to you with. At the level of individual motivations, there has been a lot of research, particularly since 9/11. After 9/11, there was this kind of, why do they hate us? Why would someone engage in a suicide bombing? We just couldn't wrap our head around the level of hatred and the kind of personality that would engage in these sorts of terrorist activities. And so there's been a lot of research on who joins terrorist organizations and why do they join terrorist organizations. So this is from a study. There's been a number of studies by a guy named John Horgan. He's a psychologist, and he runs something called the International Center for the Study of Terrorism at Penn State. And they study the psychology of someone who signs on to be a suicide bomber, or the psychology of somebody who is recruited into a terrorist movement or a terrorist network, primarily by working with people who have been recruited into those networks and then for whatever reason moved away from them. They either said, no, this is terrible, I can't support this anymore, and they had kind of a personal change of heart, or they were captured, and then after they were captured, started to question some of the activities that they were engaged in. So based on the study of, I think he for this study he looked at about 60 people who had been active within terrorist organizations and just asking them questions about their own personal psychology. These are the characteristics they came up with. So an individual joining a terrorist organization is angry, they're alienated, they're disenfranchised, they're looking for something to belong to. And it doesn't really matter what it is. It could be a community group. It could be, a sports team. They could become avid sports fans, or it could be a terrorist organization. They're just desperately looking for some sort of belonging. And there's a feeling of anger, there's a feeling of alienation, and there's a feeling of disenfranchisement. So they have some sort of grievance to start with. They feel as if they're not respected, haven't achieved anything. They're kind of down and out. They also think that the current political apparatus isn't a venue in which they have any real power. So if somebody had a political grievance, if one of your friends came to you and said, oh, I think the government is screwing up, and I think our system is corrupt and flawed, and I just get really depressed when I watch the news, you might give them the advice, well, maybe you could run for office, or maybe you could find a candidate that you believe in and support that candidate, or maybe, you write a letter to your representative and tell them some of these things, and they'll actually kind of listen to you and respond to you. Somebody who's considering joining a terrorist organization is not going to think that those conventional forms of political involvement are going to produce any real change. They feel powerless given the existing structure, and so they're going to resort to these unconventional means to achieve their political goals. They're also going to identify really strongly with victims of social injustice. So they are going to zero in on something that they think is fundamentally wrong. There's people that are being oppressed, being persecuted, and really experience that almost as if, even if they're not part of that group, they're going to experience it as if it were their own injustice. There's been numerous studies of Americans, just kind of your traditional American, wasn't born overseas, was born in this country, and for whatever reason, they become really wrapped up in the struggle of someone far, far away, some group of people far, far away. It could be, the Palestinians and some of the ways in which they're suffering. It could be any group, and it impacts them as almost as if they were a part of that group. They're watching videos online, and they're crying, and they become radicalized. They see this as this injustice that can only be fixed through violence, and they'll travel to those organizations. They'll try to make contact with people in terrorist organizations that are working on behalf of that group, those victims of some social injustice. So they really kind of identify strongly with people who are suffering and will fight on their behalf. They're going to be unsatisfied with talking about the problem. They might start with advocacy. They might start with learning about a situation, but they'll very quickly realize that there needs to be action taken, and violent action, right? And they don't believe that violence against the state is immoral. They think that if they're targeting their perceived source of some social injustice, that's not a moral act, that's a courageous act. That is an act of bravery. They will view themselves in kind of this heroic lens. They might have friends or family sympathetic to the cause, whatever the cause might be, and that might be how they're kind of recruited into these networks. The recent trial of Tsarnaev, the Boston Marathon bomber, pretty much the narrative that was established in that trial and the narrative that the defense for Tsarnaev really tried to push was that his brother was the one. His brother was the one that became very, very kind of absorbed in this anti-American attitude and the ways in which Muslims all over the world were being persecuted, and then recruited his younger brother, who was alienated and angry and disenfranchised, those initial motivations, into the planning for the Boston Marathon bombing, and that ultimately wasn't viewed as justification why Tsarnaev should get off lightly or should be not given the death penalty. But it is a pretty common narrative where individuals will be recruited into a cause or recruited into a terrorist network through people that they trust, people that they have confidence in, and those individuals' concerns and grievances become their own. And there's also this belief, so there's a picture of an individual that is feeling frustrated, is feeling as if they don't really matter. And there's this belief that by joining a movement, you are going to receive some sort of reward. It's going to provide social rewards, it's going to provide psychological rewards, it's going to be something exciting, and it's going to give you purpose, and it's going to embed you in a network of like-minded people and really provide you with a sense of identity, right? Provide you with a sense of solidarity with other human beings, which is what these individuals are seeking, really. The overwhelming insight that's coming from this research about individual terrorists is that they're just lacking in human connection, lacking in really feeling connected to other people, and so they seek out these movements in an attempt to rectify that. So that's kind of the individual picture. What's interesting about this is that the cause is kind of secondary. There's no specific characteristics with regard to the cause. The motivations of individuals that join terrorist organizations, it largely comes down to personality and psychology, and really just seeking to be part of something larger, and frustration with the system as it exists, frustration with the conventional channels by which we attempt to achieve social and political change. And so they seek out these other violent means. But the cause is just kind of like the icing on the cake. It's if these basic fundamental psychological characteristics are there, somebody is at risk for being recruited into a terrorist network and then becoming radicalized and perhaps even engaging in violence. So I want to talk a little bit about the connection between globalization and terrorism. A lot of this was made in a lot was made of this in the aftermath of 9/11. People talked about, how this is a symptom of the globalized world in which we live, and there's a lot of truth to that. Globalization itself can be a source of grievance for terrorist organizations. So globalization has made us aware of the ways in which we are connected to each other. And if you view your situation as one of injustice and one in which you are frustrated and thwarted and suffering all sorts of terrible occurrences in your own life, globalization opens up a whole series of scapegoats who you can blame. And you're aware of the connections between your society and other societies in ways that might help inform your grievances, right? So there was a lot of, after 9/11, there were a lot of kind of these think pieces that came out in American media asking the question, why do they hate us? And what was surprising about that is that there was a manifesto in 1996 from Osama bin Laden in which he essentially, it wasn't titled this, but it could have been, wrote why they hated us, wrote why Al-Qaeda was forming and why they were going to engage in violence directed at the West. And a lot of it had to do with U.S. foreign policy, Western influence in the Middle East, what they viewed to be Western corruption of Islamic values with these more secular values of the West. So it was all kind of there. And eventually, we developed this picture, but there was this initial moment in which everybody was kind of asking, why this is the case. And that wouldn't really be possible, like that, the articulation of those grievances wouldn't be possible without some degree of globalization, without some degree of US and Western involvement in the region, and people being deeply, deeply aware of US and Western involvement in the region. So that's a case in which globalization is actually part of the source of the grievance for terrorist organizations. Much of what Al-Qaeda was articulating in 1996 as it was laying out this vision for the ways in which they were going to engage in violence was linked to these broader trends of globalization that had been happening since the 1960s or the 1970s. Globalization also provides mechanisms that facilitate terrorist organizations. So those tools and technologies that we talked about at the outset of the course, the internet, the ease of communication across great distances, the establishment of satellite technologies, the ease of international travel, even things like that. Those facilitate communications, they facilitate trade, they facilitate connection, right? But they can also facilitate global coordination of terrorist networks. So the very same infrastructure that a multinational corporation uses to establish a presence all over the world, that infrastructure can be appropriated and utilized by terrorist actors, terrorist networks, to expand their reach and to engage in instantaneous communication, to channel their finances through various countries, to really achieve a global presence that it would have been difficult and costly to achieve even 20 or 30 years ago, prior to the internet, prior to satellite technologies, prior to cell phones, prior to relatively cheap international travel. It would have been hard to do. It also expands the impact and the resonance of terrorist attacks. You guys have probably experienced something like this in your lifetime, although it will depend on your age. I'm not sure how old you were when 9/11 happened, but for many in my generation, we watched 9/11 unfold in real time. And then we had global news networks that were able to present that story to us, and just the recurring images of these terrible, terrible attacks that made us so frightened and so just deeply unsettled. They occurred almost like on a loop constantly, right? As these global news networks with a 24-hour news cycle were trying to cover what people were demanding. It was not that they were presenting people with information they didn't want to see. People wanted to know everything that was happening with regard to 9/11, and then the subsequent attempts to address this insecurity, right? The quote-unquote war on terror, our invasion of Afghanistan, and then our military invasion of Iraq and displacing Saddam Hussein. All of that was presented to us in real time. That creates a tool for the terrorists, right? I mean, it provides us with information. It provides us with kind of a finger on the pulse of whatever's happening in the world. But it's also a tool that if you engage in an attack like this, you can enhance your impact, and you can enhance the way that that unsettling image kind of resonates within your target. And that's certainly happened with 9/11, and it's only been more the case since then. We now have technologies that weren't even really kind of online and in place in 2001. Things like Facebook and Twitter and kind of the social media side of things has developed. And in a lot of ways, that's when we think of attacks or really significant and consequential events, that's how we experience them now. So globalization can be a source of grievance. It can be a tool for both corporations and individuals and people engaging in trade, people engaging in commerce, but also terrorist networks and criminal networks. And the media and communication technologies that have emerged out of globalization can enhance. It's like a force multiplier for attacks or any sort of strategic operations that an organization like this would engage in. But there's another hopeful side to globalization. And one thing that I want you to think about, and I'd asked you to think about this last week, last lecture, is whether globalization is a force that enhances the likelihood of terrorism and creates motivations for terrorism, or is it a potential force against terrorism? Will we see terrorism decline as we become more globally connected? We've talked about in here, and many of you have talked about in your discussion posts, how globalization is really remarkable in that it's like a window is opened to all of these experiences throughout the world, that without the technologies that we have and the ability to kind of make and create communications that can be experienced globally, we just won't be aware of, what's going on in Japan. What are people my age in Libya talking about and doing? And we gain a sense of some of the really important differences, but also the things that unite us as human beings. And in that sense, globalization, if we utilize it effectively, right, that's the great promise of globalization, and particularly global communications networks, is that this creates possibilities for cross-cultural understanding. Now, when I think of, a major international adversary who we don't have a good diplomatic relationship with, like Iran, right? I can say, well, I wonder what Iranian young people or Iranian academics are thinking about, and maybe go on the internet and actually be exposed to that through Twitter or social media or YouTube, whatever it might be. So there's this possibility for connection. And the hope is that globalization and some of these communication networks will enable us to see injustice that exists in the world, really difficult, terrible situations for people in far-flung locations that we might not have been exposed to previously, and attempt to rectify those. Some of the non-governmental organizations that we talked about, or through lobbying our own political leaders in a country as powerful as the United States, maybe we can address some of the injustice and some of the suffering that exists in the world before it crystallizes into hatred, before, people develop this sense of like, oh, the United States is just this dominant force and doesn't care about us and allows us to suffer and maybe is responsible for our suffering. So that's the hope. It's kind of an idealistic vision of a better world driven by technology. But those who are advocates of globalization, particularly global communication, say, no, this possibility exists, and we see it every day. We see ways in which people from areas all over the world who their countries might not get along can actually have really deep and meaningful interactions through technology. Technology is like a cultural bridge that exists. So that's the hope. And that would, over time, reduce terrorism if personalities and attitudes change towards each other. So the other way, that's the very long-term way in which some people hope that we can target the attitudes, that feeling of angriness and anger and distrust and frustration that leads to terrorism. But we also have the problem right in front of our faces. We have the people that have already become radicalized, have grievances with the West or the United States or our government or our military or our corporations, and they have deadly weapons and know how to use them and are planning to use them. And this is the side of counterterrorism, and it is what has consumed American foreign policy for at least the last 15 years or so. So we're going to talk a little bit about what are some of the tools that we have and how they're utilized. This is a clip from the Council on Foreign Relations, in which the speaker lays out some of the ways in which we've used those tools, some of the ways in which we've been remarkably effective, some of the ways in which we've been ineffective, and both we, the United States, and the international community have a long way to go in counterterrorism. So I'll play this clip and then talk about it a little bit.
Since 9/11, the international community has made some very impressive progress in fighting global terrorism. It's deepened the legal architecture. It provides grounds for going after terrorists. It's increased the obligations that member states of the United Nations have to undertake to fight terrorism, and it's launched concrete efforts to try to combat terrorist financing, which is the lifeblood of terrorists. In the immediate aftermath of 9/11, the world came together at the United Nations to pass UN Security Council Resolution 1373, which forced member states to criminalize terrorist activities, and it forced them to go after sources of terrorist financing. There's also been a major expansion of the international conventions that actually govern the fight against terrorism. So there are now 16 major UN conventions. In addition, there's been a lot of progress made when it comes to combating weapons of mass destruction and their potential use by terrorists. Perhaps the most important UN Security Council resolution here is Resolution 1540, which criminalizes and prohibits states from getting involved in the transfer of weapons of mass destruction or related technologies to non-state actors around the world, including Al-Qaeda. Now, alongside these successes, there remain a certain number of problems, shortcomings, and dilemmas. Probably the biggest one is really just the failure of the international community to come up with a consensus definition of what terrorism actually is, which is a huge stumbling block to cooperation around the world. It remains the case that one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. Likewise, when it comes to terrorist financing, the international community has done really well when it comes to transfers between banks, but one of the big things that still trips them up are things like hawala and other informal mechanisms of transferring payments from one country to the next. Governing that area of activity has proved devilishly complex. There are also issues with respect to human rights that continue to bedevil the fight against terrorism. Early on in the global war against terrorism, as declared by the Bush administration, there were a lot of steps taken both by the United States and by some of its allies that some now look back on and say they really overstepped the bounds of fundamental human rights and violated some of our humanitarian principles. And those include issues of indefinite detention and extraordinary rendition, the setting up of ghost prisons, and the use of enhanced interrogation techniques that many now consider to be tantamount to torture. Finally, the international community still is quite divided over the priority that they place on terrorism. For the United States and many of its allies, the threat of terrorism, and particularly the prospect of terrorists armed with weapons of mass destruction, remains an existential threat, one that could create the greatest catastrophe that humanity has ever experienced. In many other parts of the world, and particularly in the poorest parts of the world, the major challenges and major threats tend to be things like disease, hunger, and water scarcity. So the world has made a lot of progress, but it still has quite a bit of a ways to go to achieve real consensus and real solidarity in this fight.
Okay, so a couple things to note there. One, I think the speaker from the Council on Foreign Relations does a really good job of laying out some of the different tools we have at our disposal to fight terrorism, which we'll talk about in a second. But this relates back to other things that we've been discussing in relation to international security. You see, there's a real divide in the international community whether traditional security achieved through military means is the goal, and our biggest threats are people who want to hurt us with violence, or the threats are things like development, poverty, disease, destruction of the environment. That's a debate between the kind of traditional definition of security and that human security concept that we talked about right at the outset of international security. He also laid out some of the really interesting challenges that the international community has faced in a broader sense. One is defining terrorism. There's a lot of disagreement on, what constitutes a terrorist actor, and there are specific groups operating throughout the world that even the major powers disagree. Is this a terrorist group or is this a legitimate fight for whatever it might be against some injustice, national self-determination, whatever the specific grievance is. So just defining terrorism has been a challenge. Controlling finances through informal networks has been a challenge. Whereas we can freeze bank accounts very easily, but sometimes money flows in more complex ways. And the priority, what priority do we place on terrorism as a foreign policy goal? So there's a number of divides in the international community. We have seen a tremendous, especially right in the aftermath of 9/11, a tremendous consolidation and kind of collaboration happening at the international level to counter terrorism, because it was an issue that it was faced by so many different countries, but lots of areas in which there's still quite a bit of work that needs to be done as well. So what are the tools? Many of them were just discussed. The tools available to fight against terrorism, what we call counterterrorism. And first would be diplomacy, persuasion and incentives to compel foreign governments and international organizations to target terrorist activities. And it was mentioned that there's a number of UN resolutions now specifically focused on things like state funding of international terrorist networks, or allowing a weapon of mass destruction or weapons generally to come into the hands of terrorist organizations. That the international community has now taken a step in formal resolutions to say this is not an activity that the international community condones and you shouldn't engage in it. Whereas 30, 40, 50 years ago, that type of activity was more or less accepted. It was frequent during the Cold War that various insurgencies or guerrilla groups would be funded on either side, whether it was the United States or the Soviet Union funding them. That was simply a way that we carried out foreign policy, and to some extent still is through covert means, but at least explicitly at the international level, there's now condemnation of some of these activities. It's not simply at the United Nations, too. A lot of this happens in bilateral negotiations. So if the United States is negotiating with a country and we know that they have a group operating within their borders that has been problematic, we say, okay, we'll give you this trade deal, but as part of this trade deal, we're going to expect cooperation on your part in targeting this terrorist activity that's happening within your borders, and also collaborating with us, providing us intelligence about this group, letting us know what you know about their actions and their activities. So on the diplomatic front, there's lots of things that we can do to attempt to target terrorist activities. Also, the mobilization of NGOs. Non-governmental organizations can be a tool to promote international law, to educate individuals about the causes of terrorism, and we've seen a lot of that work happen too. Some of the organizations that have been cited in the course of this lecture, right, studying the personality of those who join a terrorist network. Well, that's information that could be really helpful to law enforcement in other countries or to intelligence agencies as they're studying individuals that they have concerns about, trying to figure out, is this individual a threat? Would they be the type of person that would join a terrorist network? So non-governmental organizations can be a venue in which we kind of promote counterterrorism efforts as well. Law enforcement, both at the domestic level and the international level. One of the things that 9/11 brought to light is just the tremendous disconnect between different agencies doing similar things within the United States in terms of information and coordination and collaboration. So, we have local police forces, we have municipal police forces, we have state police forces, we have the FBI, we have various wings of the government that deal with foreign intelligence and information. And they seem to all be operating according to their own internal logic, and there wasn't a great deal of pooling and sharing of information or coordination and collaboration when it came to strategy. And so there has been an effort in the United States to coordinate those activities. We created something called the Department of Homeland Security, which kind of works as a hub for all of those different efforts, and also greater coordination and collaboration internationally. So, if London police are tracking a suspect and then all of a sudden he gets on a plane to the United States and they have suspicion that he might be involved in some sort of terrorist network and perhaps is gearing up towards some sort of attack or event then they can notify police in the United States, hopefully, and that coordination and collaboration across borders can happen in ways that maybe it wasn't happening 15 or 20 years ago. So there's been efforts to coordinate our efforts in the domestic sense, but also internationally. And in the domestic sense, too, we've seen, again, this is pretty controversial, but we've seen a lot of provision of hardware, training, information to police potential terrorist activities at the local level. So there was enormous amounts of money and hardware that were made available to national agencies, but also local police departments in the aftermath of 9/11. The Department of Homeland Security still provides a tremendous amount of funding and hardware to, even your local police force. And a lot of that was justified in relation to terrorist threats. If there were a terrorist attack, we need gas masks because maybe they're using a biological agent, right? Those sorts of things. So having those resources, but also having that training. A lot of city police officers might not have training in how do you deal with an international terrorist attack. Another thing that we learned from 9/11 is that you had all of these different first responders, some of whom might have been trained to deal with this activity, but some of them not, right? And so maybe we're reaching a point where the terrorist threat is so great that we need that kind of localized training. So there was also training and information, and just intelligence too, intelligence sharing, because an individual who is coming to the United States and potentially going to engage in some sort of terrorist attack, maybe the first law enforcement figure that they have contact with is a local police officer. So what sorts of things should they be on the lookout for, and what types of red flags should they be aware of? One of the very first things that happened after 9/11 was the financial instruments. And so we saw collaboration between the government and various national banks and foreign banks to freeze material support for terrorism. So anybody that we had some sort of suspicion that they might be involved with a terrorist network, or they might be providing some sort of material support for terrorist activities, we needed to ensure that they didn't have access to their funds, and they couldn't be transferring funds or wiring money to different places. And also, beyond simply freezing assets, monitoring transfers that were occurring, right? So if an individual in New York is transferring large sums of money to a bank in Pakistan, maybe we should take a look at that and try to figure out why that's happening. And maybe it's something completely innocuous, maybe it's not in any way related to terrorism, but maybe it is, right? So freezing material assets, but also monitoring what's happening with regard to the transfer of finances internationally. The next tool in counterterrorism, and one that we used quite a bit in the 2000s, was the use of military force. We had 2 wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and a number of military operations throughout the world. We talked last time about drone strikes occurring in numerous countries, and their use had risen 700% under President Obama. So military force doesn't have to be simply an invasion and an occupation like it was in Iraq and Afghanistan. It can be a coordinated attack conducted with another military. It can be an airstrike conducted via traditional means or through drones, but the use of military force. The key justification for drone strikes, the reason why they're being used as much as they are, is that our government and our military is saying, look, we have lots of information, we have lots of intelligence about where dangerous individuals are. We want to take them out, we want to kill them, and we don't necessarily want to put a pilot in harm's way flying over airspace when we can use this technology that we have to do it, and do it hopefully effectively with minimal collateral damage, with minimal civilian casualties. So we've seen a number of instances in which major figures in terrorist networks, be it Al-Qaeda or something else, have been targeted through these airstrikes, often conducted with drones. And military force is another tool in the toolbox, and it's been used pretty extensively. The last piece, and what the speaker got into with some of the more controversial aspects of our attempts to confront terrorism internationally, relates to intelligence and covert action. After 9/11, one of the things that there was a real demand for was information, right? With the way that we win the war on terror is through having information about who are the people that want to hurt us, where are they, what types of things are they engaged in. There was just this tremendous call at every level of the government for more information and more people to analyze that information and better technology to sort and process that information. And so we began to collect information from a variety of sources. Some of them were what we refer to as human intelligence. Some of it was various forms of technical intelligence. It was satellite imagery. It was system and signal intelligence, in which we're intercepting communications or intercepting emails or intercepting phone calls that are happening, right? So all of this information is being collected with the overarching goal of keeping us safe. And that has drawn a lot of controversy. It's drawn controversy in the ways in which large pools of information were being swept up, and potentially we were utilizing these intelligence operations to collect domestic information on, you and me and American citizens just going about their day using their cell phone and using their email. And there has also been pretty significant controversy over some of the human intelligence strategies utilized to get information from people that we were picking up on the battlefield in Afghanistan or Iraq, or individuals that we know had some sort of connection that raised red flags to some type of activity and then came into custody of either the United States or one of our allies. So the human intelligence side, in which many of the things that were done, the detention techniques, the interrogation techniques, came under scrutiny. And there's actually been a lot of discussion of these tactics recently because of a report that came out. It was kind of looking at our intelligence efforts, our interrogation techniques in the aftermath of 9/11, and saying, okay, what sorts of things did we do, and what type of information did it produce? Was it effective? And what really is the extent of some of the nasty things that went on? We know obviously people are being subjected to pretty extreme situations, and we had loosened some of the expectations with regard to providing cause for detention, or what types of actions you can engage in once someone is actually detained by the United States government. But really, how bad has it actually gotten? So there was a report that was released just last year by the Senate, and they went into detail with some of the things that had happened. One, people had been picked up and were in custody, and the types of interrogation techniques that they were subjected to. So I'll just play this clip. If you guys are unfamiliar with this report, it's pretty shocking, some of the actions that were taken, and so consider this my trigger warning for discussion of things that might make you uncomfortable and might kind of shock you a little bit. So we'll play this, and then I'll come back and talk about it a little bit.
The brutality is shocking. The report reveals at least 5 detainees were subjected to what it calls rectal feeding, interrogation procedures that went on for months. At least one detainee died from hypothermia.
Stripped naked, diapered, physically struck, and put in various painful stress positions for long periods of time. They were deprived of sleep for days. In one case, up to 180 hours.
One detainee had his lunch pureed and poured into his rectum. He eventually attempted to cut his wrist, chew into his arm, and cut a vein in his foot. Much of the information kept from President George W. Bush's own Secretary of State.
There are CIA records stating that Colin Powell wasn't told about the program at first because there were concerns that, and I quote, Powell would blow his stack if he were briefed.
A former top CIA official says some of the details were held close.
Those who needed to know were absolutely brought in and made parties to the conspiracy. As I said, we were very, very clear that about what it was that we intended to do, what we were doing, to make sure that we had the necessary assurances from the Justice Department that what we were doing was legal.
Some of the worst abuse occurred at a secret location called Cobalt, where detainees were walked around naked or were shackled with their hands above their heads for extended periods of time. CIA officers dragged detainees hooded down hallways, slapping and punching them. And an admission in CIA documents that waterboarding did cause physical harm. Abu Zubaydah, repeatedly waterboarded, became completely unresponsive, with bubbles rising through his open, full mouth. Internal CIA records called Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's waterboarding 183 times a series of near drownings. Torture that wasn't even effective, according to the report.
It produced little useful intelligence to help us track down the perpetrators of 9/11 or prevent new attacks and atrocities.
Okay, so that's a quick clip from CNN about the what's become known as the torture report, released by the Senate Intelligence Committee, and then it was a subject of kind of debate, broader debate within society. At the end there, you saw John McCain, who's a Republican but has been staunchly against some of the more extreme techniques used to gain intelligence and information in the context of the war on terror. There's a few things that I think are noteworthy there. In the immediate aftermath of 9/11, we were picking people up on the battlefield in Afghanistan, and there's this question of kind of where do we take these individuals and what is their status? What is their legal status? Because there are international conventions about treatment of prisoners of war, and we had to decide whether these are criminals, right? Are these people that are part of a criminal network, and we're going to try them as criminals and afford them the due process that we give to criminals? Are they prisoners of war, which under international law grants them certain protections, or are they something else, right? And do we create kind of a new legal category, and what are the expectations for how they're going to be treated? So there was a whole kind of legal debate internally within the Bush administration, and then it mushroomed out into the international community at large. And we kind of, what enabled a lot of these activities was it created this gray area in which these individuals who were being picked up were not given the rights that somebody subject to criminal due process would be given. They weren't given the same rights that prisoners of war would be given. And the argument made by the Bush administration was that this is a type of war in which it's not a conventional war, and we're not fighting against conventional soldiers. And so we can't afford soldiers the same treatment that we can't afford detainees the same treatment that we would afford soldiers. And so we really need new legal language and new expectations for these individuals. So what eventually happened is we created this detention center at Guantanamo Bay, military base in Cuba. And so because these individuals weren't on the battlefield and they weren't within United States kind of national borders, there was this gray area for how they would be treated. What's interesting about the torture report is that we knew about Guantanamo Bay. What we didn't necessarily know about was all these additional locations throughout the world in which people were being picked up, people were being detained, and they were kind of like black sites in which cobalt was mentioned. We didn't really know about cobalt. We didn't know that people were being picked up and then detained in places like Egypt or Romania. And so it's much harder to scrutinize and attempt to kind of critique actions that are occurring if we're not even sure where it's happening. There's also, the torture reports revealed a range of different actors. The CIA is pretty active. The Central Intelligence Agency is pretty active in this. But we had figures from the military. At times we had private contractors, people that are just brought in on a contract basis by the U.S. military or the CIA to perform some of these activities. At times this is happening in collaboration with foreign governments. And some of the most egregious acts of what many would allege to be torture were occurring at the hands of foreign governments that maybe aren't bound by the same constraints that our military or our CIA might be bound by. And the techniques were pretty striking. Waterboarding was mentioned. Waterboarding is essentially a simulated drowning. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, over 180 times, was waterboarded in an attempt to get information about the perpetrators and the network behind 9/11. Rectal feeding, forced standing, people not being allowed to sleep for 180 hours. Many individuals critical of these actions were saying, this is absolutely torture. How can we not say that this is torture? And then the argument that McCain raised at the very end, there's mixed research on the effectiveness of these types of techniques. If you subject an individual to these types of techniques and you push them to their physical limits and you simulate death, simulate drowning, are you getting useful information that actually helps you? Or are they just saying anything that they think that you want to hear in order to stop the pain and stop the suffering? And there's a lot of questions about that. There's questions even by those internal to our military or people who have retired from the Central Intelligence Agency that were very, very critical of some of the actions that were taken. So there was a period of many years in the aftermath of 9/11 in which we were just desperately seeking information and desperately seeking intelligence that would help to make us secure against terrorism, in which seemingly the limits that we traditionally placed on detention of individuals, the types of activities that we engage in when we're trying to get information from individuals, it seems like those were loosened, to say the least. So a question that you should think about is what limits, if any, should we place on our counterterrorism efforts across the globe? Where is the boundary? Where's the line? We need information, obviously. Terrorism is a threat. It's a real threat. And we need information in order to confront it. But should there be limits on the types of techniques, the types of strategies that we use in order to get the information that we need? And that is a question that continues to animate both debate within the United States, whether it be about domestic surveillance or the types of information that our government is collecting about us in an attempt to keep us safe, or our actions abroad, the types of things that we did in the context of warfare or attempting to get human intelligence out of individuals that we had detained and were holding in various places throughout the globe. So it's an open question, and it's really an ethical question. It's a question of where do you come down on the expectations that limits should be placed on what the government can do in the context of attempting to achieve security. So think about that question. If you guys are interested in this broader issue and some of the uses of torture or enhanced interrogation, whatever whatever you want to call it, whatever title you want to give it, there's been some pretty good Frontline documentaries. Frontline is a show on PBS, a weekly show, I believe, in which they talk about some of the actions and some of the debates, internal debates about the use of enhanced interrogation techniques in the context of the war on terror. So if that's something that interests you, I'd encourage you to go check those out. They're available for free, I think, on the PBS website. All right. So that wraps up our discussion of terrorism. Hopefully this has given you some tools to help understand what terrorism is, the sources and motivations of terrorism, and how we confront it. What are the ways that we deal with terrorism? What are the tools that we have to attempt to counteract terrorism? A couple of reminders. So you're wrapping up your informal negotiations this week in the ICON simulation. Do remember that your midpoint report is due Sunday, August 2nd at 8 p.m. The midpoint report is your opportunity to reflect on what's been going on in the informal negotiations, these kind of country-to-country negotiations that have been happening, and look back at your initial strategy and think, is that still the strategy that I want to follow? What have the obstacles been? Who are my allies? Who might be problematic in terms of getting what my country wants? So that is due by Sunday at 8 p.m. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me. Next week, we're going to open the formal Security Council meeting, in which we'll actually be debating and deciding upon the different resolutions, whether or not they'll pass. So that should be a lot of fun. Hopefully you guys have been enjoying the informal negotiations this week. On topic for next week, again, there's not as much reading and lecturing next week, so that you have plenty of time to participate in the icon simulation. But the topic next week is international political economy. You're going to read Chapter 8, or a section of Chapter 8 in the Lamy textbook. And as you do so, think about how your life has been impacted by economic globalization. How might your consumption and your lifestyle be different if our economy was less globalized and more locally based? So if you had to rely upon goods and services that were available locally as opposed to globally, what would that look like? Would it be significantly different? And then lastly, and this is the really important piece, what forms of international cooperation are necessary to have such a globalized economy? Oftentimes we participate in the economy, we recognize that it's global in nature, but we don't think about all of the steps that need to be taken in order for that to function and to function as efficiently as it does. So what types of international cooperation do you need in order to have such an economy? So we'll stop there and we'll pick up with international political economy next time. Thanks.